The Sith never sought war in the way the Jedi understood it. A lightsaber clash was a spectacle, a moment of raw power, but for the Sith, it was a failure of foresight. True victory required no battlefield, no grand confrontation. It unfolded in whispers, in choices made without realizing who had set them in motion. Where the Jedi stood in the light, proclaiming their truth for the galaxy to hear, the Sith built their power beneath the surface, shaping events without ever revealing their presence. The Jedi believed in transparency, in a universe governed by order and harmony. They taught that knowledge must be shared, that emotions must be tempered, and that power, if used, must always serve the greater good. Their temples were open to study, their archives preserved for generations to learn from. They saw the Force as a guiding principle, something to be understood and followed. But the Sith knew something deeper, something older. Power was not found in open hands, but in the closed fist. Knowledge was not meant for all. It was a weapon, sharpened in secrecy, wielded with precision. This difference between the two orders was not just a matter of ideology. It was the reason the Sith endured, even when they seemed to vanish from history. Time and again, Jedi historians recorded the extinction of the Sith, believing their doctrine to be broken, their kind wiped out. Each time, they were wrong. The Sith never truly vanished. They changed, adapted, became something the Jedi could no longer recognize until it was too late. The Jedi saw war as a struggle of armies and champions. The Sith saw war as a game of inevitabilities. At the heart of this strategy was the rule of two. To an outsider, it seemed like a restriction, a self-imposed limitation that kept the Sith from ever becoming more than a shadow of what they once were. But that was exactly why it worked. A master and an apprentice. No vast armies, no councils, no divisions. Two minds aligned toward a single purpose. The apprentice learned not only the Force, but the art of deception, the subtlety of influence, the patience to build something that would last beyond a single lifetime. The master knew their fate, that one day their apprentice would surpass them, and in that act of betrayal, the Sith would grow stronger. This was not weakness, it was refinement. While the Jedi's numbers swelled, their teachings spread too thin, diluted by endless interpretations and contradictions, the Sith remained singular in purpose. Each new apprentice inherited the accumulated knowledge of generations, sharpened, tested, made more precise. A single Sith could tip the fate of an entire civilization without raising a weapon. It had happened before. It would happen again. The Republic, in its arrogance, believed the Sith to be extinct for over 1,000 years. The Jedi, who claimed to be the galaxy's greatest seekers of truth, accepted this without question. They searched for enemies on the battlefield, in distant temples, among the darkened corners of the Outer Rim. But the Sith had long abandoned such crude ambitions. They did not hide in ruins or lost worlds. They stood in the Senate, their hands guiding the very laws that the Jedi swore to protect. This was the true brilliance of the Sith's survival. They did not challenge the Jedi where they were strongest. They did not attempt to fight an order with thousands of trained warriors spread across the stars. Instead, they positioned themselves in places the Jedi were blind to. They understood that power was not found in the might of one's army, but in the control of those who commanded it. A war fought in the open could be lost, but a war fought in the mind, in the corridors of power, in the choices made by those who never even knew they were being guided. That was a war that could never be defeated. Darth Bane, the architect of the modern Sith, had understood this truth centuries before the fall of the Jedi Order. He saw the weakness of the Sith as they once were. Too many vying for power, tearing themselves apart in the name of supremacy. It was a system doomed to fail. He burned it down and built something stronger, a doctrine that thrived not on conquest, but on patience. He knew that power gained too quickly was power wasted. True dominance came from planting seeds that would grow long after the one who planted them was gone. The Jedi, for all their wisdom, never learned this lesson. They reacted, always looking for threats in the present, never realizing that the war had already been decided long before their blades ignited. While they meditated in their temples, the Sith shaped the very foundations of the galaxy they sought to protect. While they debated morality, the Sith reshaped the future itself. The brilliance of the Sith's long game was that by the time the Jedi realized the true threat, it was already too late. The Republic they had served for generations had become their prison. The very soldiers they had commanded turned against them in an instant. They were not defeated in a final battle of legends. They were dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy they never even saw. The Jedi had always thought the Sith were their opposite, their dark reflection, a force that sought war and destruction. They never understood that the Sith had become something else entirely, something beyond their ability to fight. This was not a war of armies or fleets. It was a war of inevitability, fought in shadows and sealed with choices made long before the first blade was drawn. The Jedi saw themselves as guardians of the galaxy. The Sith ensured they would become relics of history. Darth Sidious never stormed the Jedi Temple. He never raised an army to march against the Republic. He did not fight his enemies with brute force or open conflict. His weapon was something far more devastating. He moved unseen, wrapped in a veil of trust, wearing the face of a servant while pulling the strings of an empire not yet born. The Jedi believed the Sith to be creatures of destruction, remnants of an ideology that had collapsed under its own weight. They failed to recognize that the greatest Sith Lord in history had already taken his place at the heart of their republic. The rise of Palpatine was not a sudden event. It was the result of careful planning, of generations of Sith understanding their enemies' weaknesses and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the time the Jedi Council became aware of the Sith's return, the war was already lost. Sidious did not need to conquer the Republic. He became the Republic. The Senate, the judiciary, the military, every institution the Jedi thought they served had already been turned against them, and they never saw it happening. The Jedi had long believed that the Sith relied on fear and aggression, that their return would be marked by battlefields and bloodshed. That was their greatest miscalculation. Sidious did not need to wield a red blade to destroy them. He needed only to guide them into their own downfall, to let their choices undo them. The Sith had always understood that power was perception. People did not need to be forced into obedience if they could be made to believe that submission was in their best interest. As Senator Palpatine of Naboo, he was seen as a diplomat, a man of reason who sought peace and stability in a republic plagued by bureaucracy and corruption. He positioned himself as the voice of reform, gaining allies within the Senate while the Jedi remained detached from the political arena. They had chosen to separate themselves from the Republic's governance, believing that their role was above politics. Sidious made certain that by the time they realized their mistake, they had no influence left. Everything he did was designed to present himself as the answer to problems he had engineered. The Trade Federation blockade of Naboo was not an act of corporate greed, but the first step in a larger deception. The crisis allowed Palpatine to rise to power, securing the position of Supreme Chancellor, while ensuring that the Republic became more dependent on centralized authority. Each new conflict, manufactured, orchestrated, drove the galaxy closer to embracing the need for absolute control. The Jedi, trapped in their own arrogance, believed they could sense the dark side, that they would know if the Sith had infiltrated their ranks. They did not understand that the dark side did not always announce itself in grand gestures. It was subtle, creeping into the spaces between laws and policies, shaping reality without the need for open confrontation. Sidious never once spoke a word of Sith doctrine in the Senate chambers. He did not need to. Every political maneuver, every policy enacted, carried the imprint of his will. Misinformation was his greatest weapon. While the Jedi debated the origins of the Clone Wars, Sidious had already chosen its outcome. He played both sides, controlling the Republic as Supreme Chancellor, while orchestrating the separatist movement through his apprentice, Darth Tyrannus. The war was never about territory or conquest. It was a tool designed to erode trust in the Jedi, to turn them into warriors instead of peacekeepers, to leave them so entangled in the Republic's survival that they would not see their own destruction until it was upon them. The brilliance of his deception lay in how easily the Jedi fell into the roles he had crafted for them. By the time they recognized their mistake, they had already become what they swore to fight against. They led troops into battle. They accepted military ranks. They justified decisions that went against their own teachings because they believed the greater good required it. But Sidious understood something they did not. The greater good was an illusion. Power was the only truth, and those who failed to recognize that were destined to be ruled by those who did. Even when the Jedi began to suspect something was wrong, it was too late. Their authority had been undermined. Their allies in the Senate had turned against them. The Republic, which they had sworn to protect, saw them as relics of an outdated era, obstacles to progress rather than guardians of peace. Sidious did not need to destroy them in battle. He simply made them irrelevant. By the time the Jedi finally moved against him, they did so as fugitives, as traitors to a republic that no longer existed. They came before him not as victors, but as the last remnants of a broken order, desperate to undo what had already been decided. Sidious did not win by fighting them. He won by making them fight a war they could never win, by ensuring that when the moment of reckoning arrived, they would stand alone. The Jedi had spent 1,000 years preparing for the return of the Sith, training themselves to confront an enemy they believed would come in darkness and fury. But the Sith had evolved beyond the need for ancient rivalries and grand battles. They had learned that true power was not seized with a blade, but woven into the very fabric of civilization. Sidious was not a conqueror. He was a craftsman, reshaping the galaxy with words and choices, ensuring that by the time his reign began, there was no one left who could challenge him. The Jedi Order did not fall in a single night. It fell over years, in compromises made, in wars fought on false pretenses, in trust placed in the wrong hands. Sidious did not destroy them. He let them destroy themselves, guiding them with the lightest of touches, setting events into motion that could not be stopped. The brilliance of his victory was that when the final blow came, the Jedi did not even realize they had already lost. The Jedi Order had long convinced itself that strength meant control. They saw their skill with the lightsaber, their mastery of the Force, and their code of discipline as proof that they could withstand any challenge. They trained for centuries to wield their weapons with precision, to stand against the forces of darkness as warriors of light. But they never realized that the battle had already been decided before their blades were ever drawn. The Sith understood something the Jedi refused to acknowledge. Strength was not found in physical power alone. A war could be lost long before it was fought if the enemy dictated the conditions. The Jedi believed they were the dominant force in the galaxy, that their ability to stand against the Sith in open combat ensured their victory. but their focus on battle blinded them to the reality of their situation. The Sith had no need to confront them directly. They let the Jedi believe they were winning, while slowly unraveling the very foundation of their order. This illusion of control was the greatest trick the Sith ever played. The Clone Wars were designed to give the Jedi the appearance of authority, while stripping them of everything that made them strong. They were given command over legions of soldiers, turned into generals leading battles across the stars. They saw this as proof of their influence, of their ability to shape the future. But with every campaign, they lost something far more important. The Jedi were meant to be keepers of the peace, not warriors. They had spent generations cultivating an image of wisdom, of restraint, of moral superiority. Yet now they stood on the front lines of war, cutting down enemies in the name of the Republic. They justified these actions by telling themselves they were fighting for peace, that the sacrifices they made were necessary to end the conflict. But peace forged through battle was an illusion. With every decision they made, they stepped further from their true purpose and closer to the trap the Sith had laid for them. Darth Sidious understood that war was not won through superior firepower. It was won by controlling the mind of the enemy, by making them believe that their choices were their own when, in reality, they were walking a path set before them. The Jedi thought they had control over the war. They did not. They thought their victories mattered. They did not. The Sith had ensured that no matter how many battles the Jedi won, the outcome would be the same. The Jedi's greatest weakness was their need to believe in their own righteousness. They saw themselves as defenders of peace, champions of justice, incapable of being led astray. They did not recognize that their actions had already condemned them. As they fought on distant worlds, the Republic they served was turning against them. The Senate, once their ally, now saw them as soldiers rather than protectors. The people who had once looked to them for guidance now saw only warriors, no different from the enemies they claimed to fight. This was not a war of armies, it was a war of perception, and the Sith controlled the narrative. Every battle the Jedi fought pushed them further into the role of aggressors. They believed that their discipline, their teachings, and their connection to the Force would shield them from corruption. But war does not leave those who fight it unchanged. The Jedi were forced to make compromises, to accept strategies they once rejected, to justify actions that went against everything they stood for. And with every compromise, they became something else. The Sith did not need to destroy the Jedi through combat. They let the Jedi destroy themselves. They allowed them to fight for a republic that no longer needed them, to place their trust in an army that would one day turn against them. By the time the war reached its final days, the Jedi had lost their place in the galaxy. They had become relics of a past that no longer existed, warriors without a war to fight. The brilliance of the Sith's deception was that it left the Jedi with no way out. If they refused to fight, they would be seen as cowards, unfit to lead in a time of crisis. If they continued, they would become exactly what the Sith wanted them to be, soldiers bound by duty rather than wisdom. They had been maneuvered into a position where every choice led to their downfall. In the end, the Jedi never truly lost a battle. They lost themselves. They had spent centuries believing that their strength lay in their ability to wield the Force, to stand as guardians of order. But true strength was never about power. It was about control, and the Sith had controlled them from the very beginning. The war was never about who had the greater army or who could fight with greater skill. It was about who dictated the terms of engagement. The Jedi believed they were in command. They never realized they had been playing a role scripted for them long before the first shot was fired. When Order 66 came, it was not a moment of conquest. It was a formality. The Jedi had already fallen. Their fate had been sealed the moment they accepted their place in the war, the moment they chose to fight an enemy they could never truly see. The Sith had not needed to defeat them in open battle. They had merely guided them to the point where their destruction became inevitable. The Jedi had always thought their greatest threat would come in the form of an enemy with a lightsaber in hand. They never understood that the deadliest attack is the one that makes you lower your guard. The Republic they had sworn to protect had been reshaped around them. The army they commanded had been programmed to eliminate them. The leader they trusted had been their enemy all along. And in the end, when the Jedi were cast down and their temple burned, there was no great battle, no last stand against the darkness. The war had been won long before the first shot was ever fired. The Sith had already secured their victory. The Jedi had merely played their part. The Jedi thought war was won by warriors. The Sith knew better. A battle could be lost before it even began, shaped by those who controlled the conditions. The Jedi trained for combat, but the Sith trained for control. A lightsaber was powerful, but an idea planted in the right mind could reshape civilizations. History was not written by armies, but by those who dictated their movements. The Republic had endured for 1,000 years, its systems deeply entrenched. To topple it with military force was impossible. The Sith never intended to conquer through war. They sought to turn the Republic's institutions against it, ensuring its collapse came from within. Every senator, every trade dispute, every moment of political unrest was carefully placed on the board, leading the galaxy toward an empire that would not need to be seized but welcomed. Palpatine's rise was not a stroke of luck. It was the culmination of centuries of Sith strategy, a slow but deliberate erosion of the Republic's foundations. By the time the Jedi suspected the Sith had returned, the war was already lost. Sidious did not take power through force. He became necessary. The Republic was drowning in corruption, paralyzed by bureaucracy. He presented himself as the answer to its problems, gaining trust while ensuring that each crisis pushed him closer to ultimate control. The Trade Federation blockade of Naboo was the opening move. It was not about taxation or territorial disputes. It was a test, proof that the Republic could be manipulated into inaction. The Jedi were sent as peacekeepers, but their involvement only gave legitimacy to a crisis designed for a singular purpose: to elevate Palpatine. When Queen Amidala called for a vote of no confidence, the Senate believed it was acting of its own accord. In reality, it had been maneuvered into replacing one leader with another who had already planned every step ahead. The Republic prided itself on democracy, but power had always belonged to those who understood how to shape perception. The Sith did not impose tyranny by force. They created circumstances that made the Republic hand them control willingly. Every conflict, every manufactured emergency made Palpatine more indispensable. The Senate, caught in endless debate, failed to see that with each new authority granted to him, their own influence faded. The Jedi should have recognized the signs. They had studied the rise and fall of civilizations, warned against the dangers of unchecked power. But they had become complacent, assuming the Sith could only return as conquerors, not politicians. They searched for warriors and warlords, never suspecting that the most dangerous Sith in history stood before them wrapped in the illusion of democracy. By the time the Clone Wars erupted, the Jedi had already been defeated. They thought they were fighting to protect the Republic, but the Republic no longer existed in the form they had once served. It had been reshaped into a machine designed to justify its own destruction. The Jedi, once symbols of wisdom and peace, were now leading armies, dictating strategy, engaging in warfare. The Republic had never relied on them in this way before, and that shift was no accident. Palpatine understood that the Jedi's true power was not their combat skill, but their influence. As long as they were seen as peacekeepers, their presence was a threat to Sith control. But as generals, their image changed. The more they fought, the more they resembled the enemies they once opposed. The people who had once looked to them for protection now saw warriors rather than guardians. The war was not about conquest. It was about shifting perception. The Jedi, who had always sought to remain separate from politics, had become deeply entangled in the Republic's survival. They had no choice. If they refused to fight, they would be seen as cowards. If they continued, they would become soldiers of the Republic, rather than defenders of the Force. They had been led into a position where every decision worked against them. In the end, they never saw the real battle. It was never fought on the front lines. It was fought in the Senate, in the offices of bureaucrats, in the minds of those who believed the Republic needed a strong leader to survive. By the time the Jedi realized they had been manipulated, the people no longer trusted them. The Senate had given Palpatine the power he needed. The war had done its job. When Order 66 came, it was not a final confrontation. It was a formality. The Jedi were already isolated, already perceived as a liability. The clone army, which they had come to rely on, was never truly theirs. The Republic they had sworn to protect had turned into something else, and the Jedi had helped build it. The Sith did not need to win through battle. They had made the Jedi fight a war that was never theirs to win. When the final moment came, there was no great stand, no last chance for redemption. There was only the realization that the war had been fought and lost before the first shot was ever fired. The Jedi had played their part to perfection, never realizing who had written the script. The Jedi believed destiny was written in the currents of the Force, a path that could be seen by those wise enough to interpret its flow. They placed their faith in prophecy, convinced that their understanding of fate was absolute. But prophecy is only as powerful as the interpretation it is given, and the Sith understood this better than anyone. A vision of the future was not a certainty. It was an opportunity, a moment to shape events rather than be bound by them. The Jedi saw prophecy as a promise of what was to come. The Sith saw it as a tool, something to manipulate, something to control. The Jedi had spent centuries waiting for a savior, a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force. They did not question what balance truly meant. They assumed it would be a victory for their cause, a final defeat of the dark side. But the prophecy was never that specific. It spoke only of balance, a term open to interpretation. The Jedi assumed balance meant the triumph of light over darkness, but the Sith understood a far more chilling truth. If the Force had been tipped in favor of the Jedi for 1,000 years, true balance could only be achieved by their downfall. Darth Sidious and Darth Plagueis did not reject prophecy. They embraced it. They did not see the future as fixed, but as something to be molded, something they could bend to their will. Where the Jedi sought to predict fate, the Sith sought to create it. The Sith did not wait for visions to come to pass. They worked in the shadows, ensuring that events unfolded in ways that suited their ambitions. Anakin Skywalker was their greatest victory. The Jedi believed he was the chosen one, the fulfillment of an ancient promise. But they never considered the possibility that they had misread the prophecy, that the chosen one would not save them, but destroy them. They found him as a child, marveled at his potential, and convinced themselves that he was meant to serve their cause. They did not see that the moment they took him in, they had already ensured their own destruction. Sidious did not need to create Anakin. The Jedi had already done that for him. He only needed to guide the boy toward the destiny they had blindly set in motion. He nurtured Anakin's doubts, fed his fears, gave him the answers the Jedi refused to provide. The Jedi told Anakin to suppress his emotions. Sidious showed him how to use them. The Jedi demanded obedience. Sidious offered understanding. The Jedi trained him to fight darkness. Sidious showed him that the darkness had always been within him. Darth Plagueis had once boasted that the Sith could manipulate life itself, that they had discovered the means to create and sustain existence through the dark side. He and Sidious had studied the deepest mysteries of the Force, learning to twist its currents in ways the Jedi refused to acknowledge. They did not wait for destiny to deliver what they wanted. They reached into the Force and shaped it themselves. It is no coincidence that Anakin Skywalker's origins were shrouded in mystery. No father, only the will of the Force. The Jedi saw this as a miracle. The Sith saw it as confirmation of their own mastery. If Plagueis and Sidious had indeed experimented with creating life through the Force, what better proof of their success than the birth of a being with unparalleled potential? The Jedi thought they had discovered their savior, but in truth, they had only found a creation of their enemies. The Sith had no need to directly control Anakin. They only needed to plant the right doubts, to ensure that when the moment came, he would choose their path willingly. Every lesson the Jedi taught him, every restriction they placed upon him, only made their eventual failure inevitable. They tried to shape him into their ideal of a Jedi, never realizing they were pushing him further toward the very thing they feared. Sidious did not need to turn Anakin against the Jedi with lies. He only had to show him the truth the Jedi refused to admit. They preached about selflessness, yet they expected unwavering loyalty. They spoke of peace, yet they sent him to fight in war. They claimed to trust him, yet they withheld knowledge, kept him at arm's length, denied him the rank of master despite his achievements. The Jedi wanted him to be their savior, but refused to let him be their equal. By the time Anakin made his choice, it was not a betrayal. It was an inevitability. The Jedi had set the conditions for their own downfall. They had created the Chosen One, but they had never controlled him. Sidious did not need to force Anakin's hand. He only needed to let the Jedi push him to the point where their destruction seemed like the only path forward. The Sith had mastered the art of self-fulfilling prophecy. They did not see the future as something to predict, but as something to shape. The Jedi had spent centuries believing the Chosen One would bring balance. The Sith ensured that he did, but not in the way the Jedi had ever expected. Darth Plagueis understood that wars were not won with armies alone. The true path to power was not through conquest, but control. He was not a warrior. He was a strategist, an architect of deception who built his empire in the shadows long before a single battle was fought. His influence stretched beyond the Force, beyond the Sith's ancient rivalries with the Jedi. His reach extended into the economic heart of the Republic, into the systems that dictated trade, finance, and military production. The Republic believed itself stable, guided by democratic principles, but its foundation was not held together by laws or the will of the Senate. It was controlled by those who dictated the flow of credits, and Plagueis ensured that the Sith controlled it all. The Jedi had always seen the Sith as warriors, wielders of the dark side who sought domination through brute strength. But Plagueis was unlike any Sith before him. He understood that power was not taken, it was accumulated, woven into the very fabric of society. While the Jedi meditated on balance and peace, he reshaped the galaxy's economy, embedding the Sith's influence so deeply that by the time war came, the Republic had already been bought and sold. It was no accident that the banking clan, the Trade Federation, and the corporate alliance all found themselves at the center of the galaxy's greatest conflict. These were not mere business entities. They were weapons, tools designed to shift power in ways the Jedi never noticed. Plagueis ensured that these organizations were controlled by those who could be manipulated, leaders who would unknowingly serve the Sith's greater plan. By securing their loyalty, he gained something far more valuable than a fleet or an army. He gained control over the very systems the Republic depended on to function. The Jedi believed they were defenders of justice, but they had no influence over the structures that determined galactic stability. They wielded lightsabers, but they did not control trade routes. They led clone armies, but they did not fund them. The Republic's reliance on private corporations to maintain its economy was its greatest weakness, and the Sith exploited it without ever needing to reveal themselves. When the Clone Wars began, the Republic did not realize that both sides of the conflict were being funded by the same hand. The banking clan financed the Republic's war effort, while also ensuring the Separatists had the resources to continue fighting. It was an endless cycle, a war designed not to be won, but to be prolonged. Plagueis did not live to see the final stages of his plan. Sidious ensured his master's death before claiming the throne for himself. But Plagueis' work had already reshaped the Republic. The war that followed was not about military victories, it was about dependency. The Senate became reliant on emergency powers. The Republic became dependent on its growing army. The Jedi, once independent, were now locked into a system they no longer controlled. By the time the Jedi realized what had happened, it was too late. They searched for Sith warriors in the shadows, never suspecting that their true enemy had been at the negotiating table, controlling the flow of wealth and resources that dictated the fate of the Republic. The Sith had played the long game, ensuring that when the war ended, the Republic would not survive. In its place would stand an empire, built not through brute force, but through the silent hands that had been shaping its destiny for years. The Jedi saw the Sith as little more than corrupted warriors, consumed by rage, blinded by ambition. They believed that the dark side poisoned the mind, that those who embraced it became violent and reckless. The Sith encouraged this belief, knowing that the greatest advantage was to be underestimated. In truth, Sith Lords studied the Jedi with precision. They learned their weaknesses, understood their philosophy, and mastered their teachings, not to follow them, but to dismantle them. The Jedi, however, refused to extend the same courtesy. They dismissed the Sith as relics of a past era, never realizing that the enemy had evolved beyond their expectations. The Jedi Code was meant to create discipline, control, and harmony. It taught its followers to suppress emotion, to detach from personal connections, to seek serenity over passion. But the Sith understood what the Jedi refused to admit. Suppression was not balance. The Jedi spoke of peace, yet waged war. They taught selflessness, yet ruled over the Republic's affairs as an elite order above the common people. They preached detachment, yet feared loss. These contradictions were not flaws in the Sith's eyes. They were proof that the Jedi had built their philosophy on denial rather than truth. Where the Jedi restricted knowledge, the Sith pursued it. They sought out forbidden teachings, experimented with the Force in ways the Jedi feared. Sith holocrons contained wisdom collected over generations, dark truths hidden from the galaxy because they challenged the Jedi's narrow understanding of power. The Jedi saw these holocrons as corrupting artifacts, dangerous influences that could lead to ruin. But the Sith knew that knowledge was never the enemy. Ignorance was. The most dangerous knowledge was the kind kept from those who needed it most. This was the Jedi's greatest flaw. They saw the Force as something to be controlled, as if balance could only be maintained by rigid discipline. They refused to acknowledge that passion was not inherently corrupting, that emotion was not inherently dangerous. The Sith did not fear emotion. They harnessed it, used it to fuel their strength. Anger, fear, love, ambition. These were not weaknesses but sources of power. The Jedi's insistence on restraint only created instability within their own ranks. Those who struggled with their teachings were not guided to understanding. They were cast out, left vulnerable to the very darkness the Jedi feared. Time and again the Jedi failed to recognize this pattern. They saw those who fell to the dark side as weak, as failures unworthy of redemption. They never considered that their own doctrine was flawed, that their rigid teachings created more Sith than the dark side ever could on its own. The Sith did not need to recruit. The Jedi's own students came to them willingly, seeking answers the Jedi refused to provide. The Sith studied every weakness in the Jedi Order. They understood its arrogance, its blind faith in its own wisdom. They did not seek to destroy the Jedi through open war. That was never necessary. They only needed to wait for the inevitable. Another Jedi disillusioned, another exile cast out, another Force-sensitive child told that their emotions were dangerous rather than understood. The cycle repeated itself across generations, yet the Jedi never saw the pattern. This blindness sealed their fate. The Sith never needed superior numbers or greater military strength. They only needed time. A system that denied the fundamental nature of the Force, that rejected the full spectrum of its power, would always collapse under its own weight. The Jedi saw themselves as the Force's chosen protectors. The Sith knew better. They understood the Force in ways the Jedi never dared to, and in the end, that knowledge was the difference between survival and extinction. The Clone Wars were never meant to be won. The Jedi believed they were fighting to preserve the Republic, that every victory brought them closer to restoring peace. But the war was a deception from the start, a carefully orchestrated illusion designed to destroy them. The Sith controlled both sides, ensuring that no matter how many battles the Jedi won, they were only playing into a strategy they did not understand. The separatist movement was never an organic rebellion. It was manufactured, a conflict engineered by the very power it opposed. The war had no real ideological struggle, no true division between good and evil. Count Dooku, a former Jedi turned Sith, led the separatists, while Chancellor Palpatine, secretly Darth Sidious, commanded the Republic. The Jedi saw Dooku as a fallen idealist, a threat to stability, but he was never meant to succeed. His role was to sustain the illusion of war long enough for the Jedi to lose themselves in it. The Republic's response to the separatist crisis forced the Jedi into a role they were never meant to take. They had been peacekeepers for generations, mediators who avoided conflict whenever possible. Now, they were generals, leading armies, making tactical decisions that cost thousands of lives. They were no longer above the political machine. They were its enforcers. Every battle pulled them further from their teachings, forcing them into compromises that weakened their connection to the very ideals they once defended. The Sith never needed to defeat the Jedi in combat. They only needed to change them. By making them warriors, they stripped them of their true purpose. The longer the war continued, the more the Jedi lost sight of what they were meant to be. They justified their involvement as necessary, believing that without their leadership, the Republic would fall to chaos. But their presence on the battlefield only ensured that when the final betrayal came, they would have no allies left. Every Jedi victory was another step toward their own defeat. Each battle depleted their numbers. Each mission reinforced their dependence on the clone army. Each command decision tied them further to the Republic's fate. When Order 66 was issued, the Jedi were no longer a respected order. They were war leaders, deeply entrenched in a system that had already turned against them. The brilliance of the Sith's deception was that the Jedi never realized they were losing until the end. They fought with conviction, believing they were protecting democracy, unaware that the Republic had already transformed into something else. Sidious did not need to destroy them through force. He let them fight a war that was designed to consume them, ensuring that by the time the war was over, there would be nothing left of the Jedi Order except the ruins of what they once were. The Jedi had always feared an open war with the Sith, but their destruction did not come from the dark warriors they had prepared to fight. It came from within, from soldiers they had led into battle, from a war they believed they were winning. The brilliance of Order 66 was not in its execution, but in the fact that by the time it was issued, the Jedi had already lost. The final strike was not a battle, not a grand confrontation. It was a simple command, delivered in an instant, ending 1,000 generations of Jedi rule before they could react. The Republic's clone army was the Jedi's greatest miscalculation. They had believed the clones to be their loyal allies, warriors bred to serve the Republic, shaped by the same ideals of duty and honor that the Jedi upheld. But the Sith had planned their downfall long before the first clone was ever grown. The Kaminoan scientists had not simply designed an army. They had created a weapon, programmed from the beginning to turn on its masters. The Jedi never questioned the convenience of a ready-made military force, appearing just as war began. They did not see the invisible chains binding the clones to their true purpose. When the order was given, there was no hesitation. Jedi who had fought beside their troops for years, who had led them into battle, who had trusted them, were gunned down without warning. It was not just an act of extermination. It was a psychological blow, a betrayal so complete that the Jedi had no time to process what was happening. In a single moment, they went from commanders to fugitives, hunted by the very soldiers they had once called brothers. The Jedi never considered that the clones were the Sith's greatest weapon. They had spent years searching for the Sith in the shadows, expecting an enemy they could sense through the Force. But the Sith had hidden in plain sight. The Jedi believed they understood loyalty, that the bonds they had formed with their troops would matter in the end. The clones followed orders without question. Their devotion had never belonged to the Jedi. It had always belonged to the one who had created them. The Sith had played the long game. Order 66 was not a spontaneous act of vengeance. It was a move planned generations in advance, a culmination of centuries of Sith strategy. The war had been orchestrated not for conquest, but for control. The Republic had been conditioned to see the Jedi as warriors, not peacekeepers. The Senate had been convinced that the Jedi were a threat to stability. The clone army had been trained to obey a command the Jedi never knew existed. When the order was given, the entire galaxy turned against them in an instant. There was no warning, no sign of the battle to come. One moment, the Jedi were leading the war. The next, they were being erased. The Sith had won long before the first shots were fired. By the time the Jedi understood the truth, it was already over. The Republic had become the Empire, and the Jedi Order was nothing more than a memory. The Jedi did not fall solely because of the Sith. Their destruction was not just a result of betrayal, but of their own refusal to change. The Jedi Order had survived for thousands of years, but its downfall was inevitable long before Order 66. The greatest threat to the Jedi was not the dark side. It was their own arrogance. They believed they were infallible, that their wisdom was beyond question. That belief ensured their failure. The Jedi Council was rigid, bound to traditions that no longer fit the galaxy they swore to protect. They viewed their code as absolute, refusing to consider that their strict interpretation of balance might be flawed. They taught that emotion led to corruption, that attachment led to suffering, yet they ignored the suffering created by their own detachment. They demanded obedience from their members, but rarely offered trust in return. This created an order that was not built on unity, but on control. Those who did not conform were cast aside, seen as dangerous influences rather than voices worth hearing. The most damning evidence of their failure was how they treated those who saw the truth. Jedi who questioned the Council's decisions, who sensed the growing darkness within the Republic, were dismissed or exiled. Count Dooku left not because he had fallen to the dark side, but because he recognized the corruption in the Republic and saw that the Jedi were blind to it. Qui-Gon Jinn, one of the few who distrusted the Senate, was seen as a maverick rather than a prophet. Those who might have saved the Order were ignored or silenced. The Jedi's downfall was not sudden. It was the result of centuries of misguided choices. They had isolated themselves, rejecting political involvement while still attempting to guide the Republic from the shadows. They held influence but refused responsibility. They wielded power but feared its consequences. When the Clone Wars began, they abandoned their role as peacekeepers and became warriors. They did not realize that by accepting command of the Grand Army, they had already lost. The Sith did not need to corrupt the Jedi. They only needed to let the Jedi's own decisions destroy them. Their inflexible adherence to outdated principles ensured they could not adapt to the Sith's strategy. They did not question why war had come to them so easily. They did not ask why an army had been created for them before they had even needed it. They did not consider that by taking up the Republic's fight, they had abandoned their own mission. Those who realized the truth too late had no power to change the course of events. Some Jedi tried to warn the Council. Some sensed the deception, but were dismissed. A few, like Ahsoka Tano, left before the final betrayal, understanding that the Jedi Order no longer represented what it once had. The Jedi had always seen themselves as the guardians of balance, yet they could not recognize that balance had already shifted beneath them. Their destruction was not an attack. It was a consequence. Order 66 did not bring down a strong and thriving order. It finished what the Jedi had already begun. The galaxy had stopped believing in them long before the clones turned their blasters on them. Their failures had made them relics, and when the time came, there was no one left to defend them. The Jedi Order had been wiped out in a single night, but their true erasure came afterward. The Sith had not only destroyed their bodies, but dismantled their legacy. The Jedi had ruled as advisors, as peacekeepers, as symbols of balance in the Republic, but in the aftermath of Order 66, they were remembered only as traitors. Their statues were torn down, their history rewritten, and their place in the galaxy reduced to a cautionary tale of arrogance and betrayal. The brilliance of the Sith's final move was that no war was needed to achieve it. The people turned against the Jedi willingly. Palpatine understood that power was perception. Even before he declared himself Emperor, he had spent years preparing the public for the moment when the Jedi would be seen as the enemy. He had never needed to convince the entire Senate of their treachery. He only needed to plant the idea that the Jedi were dangerous, that they had ambitions beyond their place. The war had already done most of the work for him. The Jedi had spent years leading the Republic's armies, making tactical decisions that cost lives, fighting a war that had no clear villain or hero. By the time Order 66 was issued, the Senate no longer saw them as peacekeepers. They saw them as warriors, as figures who had taken power without responsibility. The moment the Jedi fell, Palpatine moved swiftly to fill the vacuum. He did not simply declare their extinction. He ensured they would never be remembered as they once were. His first act was to reframe the Clone Wars as the final betrayal. The Jedi, he claimed, had attempted to overthrow the Republic, to seize control through military force. The Grand Army, loyal and unquestioning, had saved the Republic by eliminating them before they could succeed. He presented himself as the victim, the wise leader who had barely survived their treachery, and in doing so, he erased 1,000 generations of service overnight. The Jedi had always relied on the Republic's faith in them. That faith had been shattered before they even realized it was happening. The Senate did not rise in protest. There was no great outcry against their extermination. Instead, there was relief. The war was over. The Republic had been saved. The Jedi had been the problem all along, and now that they were gone, order could finally be restored. Palpatine's propaganda machine moved quickly to reinforce this narrative. The archives were altered, statues were torn down, Jedi artifacts were seized, not to be studied, but to be destroyed. The temple, once a symbol of peace, became the Imperial Palace, a message that the past had been erased and the future belonged to the Empire. Holovids spread throughout the galaxy, showing footage of Jedi igniting their blades against clone troopers, carefully edited to paint them as aggressors. News reports detailed their supposed corruption, their hidden plots, their reckless defiance of the Republic's will. Every citizen who had once admired them was given a new story to believe. The most devastating consequence of this was not just the Jedi's erasure from history. It was the death of the Republic's trust in the Force itself. The Jedi had been its greatest champions, its most visible symbols. When they were cast down, the Force became something feared, something dangerous. Those who still spoke of it were ridiculed, treated as fools clinging to an outdated religion. The Sith had won not only by eliminating the Jedi, but by ensuring that their very ideology would fade into obscurity. This was the true brilliance of the Sith's final victory. The Jedi did not die as martyrs. They did not become legends to be honored in secret. They became a warning, a name spoken with disdain, a failed order that had brought the Republic to the brink of collapse. The few survivors who remained could not rebuild what had been lost. They were fugitives, scattered and hunted, forced into silence while the Empire rewrote history. The Jedi had always believed they would endure, that their knowledge and legacy would outlive them. They never considered that their greatest defeat would not be in battle, but in the minds of the people they once served. The Sith had not only destroyed them, they had made the galaxy forget why they had ever mattered at all. The destruction of the Jedi was never meant to be a single event. Palpatine did not merely seek their extermination, he sought to erase them from history. Their defeat on the battlefield was only the beginning. The true war was fought in the minds of the next generation. The Jedi had spent centuries shaping the Republic's ideals, guiding its rulers, preserving knowledge that spanned thousands of years. If the Sith wanted their empire to last, they could not allow those ideas to survive. The conquest of the galaxy was not just military, it was ideological. The people had already been conditioned to accept the Jedi as traitors. Order 66 had ensured that the Republic saw them as a threat. But fear alone was not enough. Palpatine understood that as long as the Jedi's teachings remained, their influence could return. The very idea of the Jedi had to be rewritten, transformed from history into myth, from protectors into conspirators, from symbols of balance into dangerous extremists who had nearly destroyed civilization. This was done systematically, through every institution the Empire controlled. The Jedi Temple, once the heart of their order, became the Imperial Palace. Its archives, which had held millennia of knowledge, were plundered. Artifacts, holocrons, sacred texts, Anything that could preserve the Jedi's true legacy was confiscated or destroyed. The remaining holocrons were locked away, kept only for study by the Sith, their secrets hidden from the rest of the galaxy. The Empire knew that knowledge was power. It would not make the mistake of allowing its enemies to hold on to either. Education was the next battlefield. The Empire's new curriculum presented history as Palpatine wanted it remembered. Schools taught that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic, that their actions had forced the Clone Wars into being, that they had sought to overthrow democracy. The Republic's transformation into the Empire was framed as a necessary step, a transition that saved the galaxy from chaos. The Jedi were no longer heroes of the past. They were ghosts, remnants of a broken ideology that had no place in the new order. The Jedi Code was never spoken of. The concept of the Force itself was pushed into obscurity. Those who still believed in it were ridiculed, dismissed as fools clinging to a forgotten religion. Children grew up never hearing about the Jedi as they once were, never knowing that the Republic had once depended on them. Within a single generation, they were no longer remembered as real figures, but as legends, distant, exaggerated, irrelevant. The final step was ensuring that no one could rise to challenge the Empire with Jedi teachings. The Inquisitorius, a group of former Jedi turned hunters, was tasked with eliminating anyone who still followed the old ways. Survivors of Order 66 were hunted relentlessly. Force-sensitive children were taken before they could ever learn what they were. Those who could not be turned were destroyed. The Jedi had always trained their successors from childhood. The Empire ensured that no such training could ever happen again. This was the true victory of the Sith. The Jedi were not only defeated, they were erased. The galaxy had moved on, its people reshaped by years of indoctrination. By the time the Rebel Alliance rose against the Empire, the Jedi were nothing more than stories. Few even remembered what they had stood for. The Sith had not just won a war, they had rewritten the truth itself. The Sith had spent centuries working toward the destruction of the Jedi Order, but their strategy was never as simple as complete annihilation. Darth Sidious did not need to kill every last Jedi to ensure his dominance. True victory was not in numbers, but in perception, in ensuring that even if some Jedi survived, they would never again rise as a force capable of challenging the Sith. He did not want martyrs. He wanted ghosts, fugitives running from a galaxy that no longer believed in them. The Jedi who escaped Order 66 were not overlooked. Their survival was planned, calculated to serve a greater purpose. If every Jedi had been wiped out in a single night, they might have been remembered as fallen heroes, mourned by the Republic they had sworn to protect. But by allowing some to flee, Palpatine ensured that they would be seen not as symbols of a lost golden age, but as criminals, outcasts hiding in the shadows. The official narrative was already in place. The Jedi had betrayed the Republic. They had attempted to assassinate the Supreme Chancellor. They had plunged the galaxy into war for their own selfish ambitions. Palpatine's propaganda machine ensured that the people would not see the Jedi as victims of a purge, but as threats to stability. By the time the war ended, those who had once admired the Jedi now feared them. Those who had trusted them now believed that their destruction had been necessary. Palpatine understood that survival was not the same as power. A Jedi alone, without allies, without an order, was not a Jedi at all. The strength of the Jedi had always come from their unity, their ability to teach, to guide, to protect one another. With the Order shattered, those who remained were forced into exile, unable to train the next generation, unable to share their knowledge, unable to fight back. They were alive, but they had already lost everything. But survival was not their only burden. The Sith understood that war was not just fought with weapons, but with the mind. The Jedi who lived carried more than just their wounds. They carried guilt. They had been the guardians of peace, yet they had watched the Republic fall into tyranny. They had been the commanders of the Clone Wars, yet they had been deceived into leading an army designed to turn on them. They had spent centuries preparing for the return of the Sith, only to be outmaneuvered at every turn. Every survivor knew that they had failed, and for many, that was a weight heavier than death. Yet Sidious did not leave them in silence. He did not let them hide in peace. He made sure that wherever they ran, the Empire followed. The Jedi were hunted, not just for extermination, but for sport. And he did not send faceless soldiers to do the job. He sent their own kind. This was where the Inquisitorius came in. Jedi who had once fought for the Republic now served the Empire, twisted into enforcers of the dark side. They had been broken, reshaped, reforged into hunters who tracked down their former comrades. This was not just a tactical decision, it was psychological warfare. A Jedi's instinct was to fight against the Sith, to resist the darkness. But the Inquisitors were not Sith lords. They were Jedi who had given up, Jedi who had been captured and turned, Jedi who had abandoned everything they once believed in. There was no greater cruelty than forcing a Jedi to face a fallen comrade. It was not just a battle. It was a reminder that even survival could lead to corruption. The Inquisitors were proof that hope was a lie, that holding on to the past was pointless. They were the embodiment of failure, the ultimate message that the Jedi Order was truly dead. For the hunted Jedi, the Inquisitors were more terrifying than the stormtroopers or the officers of the Empire. They were personal. They knew Jedi tactics, knew how they thought, knew how to break them. Some Jedi fought back, refusing to surrender. Others ran, staying one step ahead for as long as they could. But there were some who saw their fallen comrades and realized that there was no escape. Capture did not mean execution. It meant conversion. The Empire did not kill every Jedi it caught. It gave them a choice, join or die. Some resisted to the end. Others, worn down by exile, by fear, by loneliness, broke. The Sith had no need to train new acolytes from birth. They simply waited for the Jedi to lose faith. The impact of this strategy was devastating. The Jedi who survived were not just hunted, they were erased. The teachings of the Order could not spread. The knowledge they held could not be passed down. The children born with Force sensitivity had no one to guide them, no one to find them, no one to show them what the Jedi had once been. In time, the Jedi became a whisper, a legend barely remembered. And that was the Sith's true victory. The Jedi had always believed that as long as one of them remained, hope would never die. But hope was not enough. The survivors were not warriors fighting for a cause. They were remnants of something that no longer existed. The Sith had won not just by killing the Jedi, but by making them irrelevant. Sidious had ensured that even those who lived had already lost. The Jedi who remained were left with nothing but memories of a past they could never return to, haunted by the knowledge that they had been defeated not by strength, but by patience. By the time a new hope would rise, the Jedi were no longer the guardians of peace and justice. They were nothing more than ghosts in a galaxy that had forgotten them. The Jedi had spent centuries warning the galaxy about the Sith, preparing for the day their ancient enemy would rise again. When that day came, they never saw it happen. The Sith did not return in the way the Jedi expected. There was no open war, no vast armies under a dark banner, no declaration of conquest. The Sith did not march into battle against the Republic. They became the Republic. By the time the Jedi realized the truth, it was too late. And then, just as suddenly, the Sith vanished. Palpatine did not rule as a Sith Lord. He ruled as Emperor. The Empire did not proclaim itself an extension of the Sith Order. It declared itself the savior of the galaxy, the force that had restored order after the supposed betrayal of the Jedi. For the average citizen, the Sith were not the ones in control. They were still a memory, a long-forgotten enemy of a past age. The true brilliance of the Sith's victory was not just in seizing power, but in making the galaxy believe they no longer existed. There was no need to declare their ideology. That had been the mistake of previous Sith empires. The Sith of old had always ruled through conquest, through open displays of power. They had worn their darkness proudly, believing that fear alone would keep their enemies in check. But fear fades. Enemies regroup. The Jedi had always survived through resistance, through rebellion against the darkness. This time, there was nothing to resist. The people did not see the Sith ruling over them. They saw a government that had brought an end to war, a leader who had saved them from the chaos of the Clone Wars. Palpatine had positioned himself as a benevolent ruler, one who had been forced to take drastic measures to preserve civilization. The Jedi had been framed as the ones who nearly destroyed it. To the galaxy at large, the Sith had not won. The Republic had simply become stronger. This was why the Empire did not immediately descend into chaos. There was no widespread rebellion, no organized opposition. The transition from Republic to Empire was seamless because the people had been prepared to accept it. They had spent years watching their democracy fail, listening to reports of Jedi arrogance and treason, seeing their leaders grow weaker while the war consumed everything. When Palpatine declared himself Emperor, they welcomed him. He had already given them the illusion of choice. The peace the Empire offered was an illusion as well, but it was an effective one. The Sith did not need to rule through constant war. They ruled through control, through a system that functioned so efficiently that most citizens had no reason to question it. As long as they obeyed, as long as they did not speak against the Empire, their lives continued. The galaxy had been exhausted by war. Peace, even under an iron fist, was preferable to another conflict. This was the genius of Palpatine's rule. He did not need to enforce his will with endless battles. The Jedi had believed the Sith would return as conquerors, but the Sith had learned from their past failures. They understood that true dominance was not achieved through war, but through submission. And submission did not come through brute force alone. It came through acceptance, through ensuring that the people no longer thought to resist. Fear was the final weapon, but it was not wielded recklessly. The Empire did not need to remind its citizens of its power at every moment. Instead, it allowed fear to fester just beneath the surface, present enough to discourage rebellion, but distant enough to be ignored by those who complied. The occasional display of force, a planet devastated, a dissenter silenced, was enough to keep the population in check. Most would never experience the Empire's wrath firsthand, but they understood what would happen if they did. The Sith had won in a way that the Jedi had never imagined possible. Their victories had always been public in the past, marked by battles and sieges, by the fall of Jedi temples, and the rise of Sith strongholds. This time the victory was silent. There was no need for grand declarations. The Sith had become something greater than an order. They had become the system itself. And that was why they were never truly defeated. Even after the fall of Palpatine, after the collapse of the Empire, the Sith's legacy endured. Their methods, their ideology, the very way they had structured the galaxy did not simply vanish. They had created a new way of ruling, a structure of control so deeply ingrained that even after their apparent destruction, their influence remained. The Jedi had always thought they would recognize the return of the Sith, but the Sith had never left. They had simply become something else, something impossible to fight. Darth Bane had been dead for 1,000 years by the time the Sith claimed their final victory, but his legacy endured. More than endured. It had reached its full potential. The Jedi believed they had ended the Sith long before the Clone Wars, but they had only ended the Sith as they had once known them. They did not realize that Bane had ensured the Sith would never truly die. He saw what others could not. The old Sith Order had been powerful, but it had been doomed to fail. Thousands of Sith Lords warring among themselves, each seeking their own supremacy, had only ensured their own destruction. Bane understood that power could not be shared among equals, that true strength required discipline, patience, and secrecy. He enacted the rule of two, not as a limitation, but as a refinement. The Sith would no longer be an army, they would be a dynasty. One master to hold the power, one apprentice to crave it. This cycle would continue indefinitely, with each new Sith Lord surpassing the last. The weak would die, and only the strong would survive. It was a system designed for long-term dominance, one that the Jedi were incapable of comprehending. They thought the Sith would return in force, seeking open conquest. They never understood that the Sith had evolved past their expectations. Sidious and his master, Darth Plagueis, perfected Bane's vision. They had no need to wage a war with the Jedi Order. They made the Jedi irrelevant, turning the Republic against them and orchestrating their downfall through manipulation rather than direct conflict. This was the final evolution of the Sith, the moment they no longer needed to fight to win. The war had already been decided before the first shot was fired. Bane would have seen this as the ultimate realization of his plan. The Sith had become more than individuals. They had become an idea. The Jedi had always viewed their battle with the Sith as a war of people, of individuals who could be defeated. They did not understand that the true danger was not the Sith Lords themselves, but the philosophy they embodied. The Sith did not seek personal immortality. They sought ideological immortality. This was the greatest trick they ever played. Even when the Sith seemed to be gone, their influence endured. The rule of two had not been a path to maintaining a bloodline, but a method of ensuring that each new Sith carried forward the knowledge and ambition of all who came before. The Jedi never saw this as a real threat. They had always measured victory by destruction. They assumed that by killing a Sith Lord, they had ended the Sith. But that was never the case. The Sith did not need to win in one lifetime. They did not need to hold on to power forever. They only needed to survive long enough to set events in motion, long enough for the next in line to continue the work. When Darth Sidious fell, the Jedi believed it was over. They did not realize that his legacy had already outlived him. His empire, his methods, his understanding of power, these things did not vanish. They endured in the systems he built, in the individuals he influenced, in the lessons that had been passed down through the generations. The Sith had always been patient. They had always understood that power was not something to be seized and held indefinitely, but something that could be transferred, reshaped, and reborn. Bane had set the cycle into motion, and in doing so, ensured that the Sith would always have the last laugh. The Sith were never meant to be united. The Jedi had always believed that the greatest weakness of the Sith was their inability to work together, their constant infighting, their inevitable betrayals. What they never understood was that this was not a flaw in the Sith philosophy. It was intentional. The Sith did not seek stability. They sought strength, and strength was forged in conflict. Every Sith apprentice was a weapon meant to overthrow their master. Every master knew this. It was the price of power, the inevitable fate of the Sith. Darth Bane had seen the old Sith Order collapse under its own weight. Thousands of Sith, each vying for dominance, had torn each other apart until nothing remained. They had been so consumed by their immediate ambition that they had destroyed the very thing they had sought to control. Bane knew that if the Sith were to survive, they needed a different path. The rule of two was not about preventing betrayal. It was about ensuring that betrayal had purpose. Under the rule of two, there would always be one master and one apprentice. The master held the power, but the apprentice sought it. This created a constant cycle of refinement. Weakness could not survive. If an apprentice was strong enough to defeat their master, they proved themselves worthy to take their place. If they were too weak, they would be destroyed, and the master would find another apprentice who could challenge them. The Sith were not meant to coexist peacefully. They were meant to sharpen each other like blades, ensuring that only the strongest carried their legacy forward. Every Sith Lord trained their apprentice with the knowledge that they were creating the instrument of their own downfall. But this was not an accident. It was the way the Sith ensured that power never stagnated. The Jedi feared attachment because they believed it led to weakness. The Sith embraced betrayal because they knew it led to strength. Darth Sidious had mastered this game better than any Sith before him. He had been the apprentice of Darth Plagueis, a Sith Lord obsessed with immortality, with bending the Force to his will to extend his life indefinitely. Plagueis believed he had conquered death. But Sidious understood the true lesson of the Sith. Immortality did not come from living forever. It came from passing down knowledge, from shaping the future through the next generation. Plagueis had seen himself as the end of the Sith lineage, the culmination of its power. Sidious knew better. There was no end. There was only the cycle. And so, as every Sith before him had done, Sidious betrayed his master. He had learned everything Plagueis had to teach, had taken everything he needed, and when the moment came, he struck. It was not an act of rage or impulse. It was calculated, methodical, inevitable. Plagueis had made himself obsolete, and the Sith did not tolerate obsolescence. Sidious carried the Sith into an era they had never known before. He did what no other Sith Lord had done. He ruled the galaxy. But even as Emperor, he followed the same path that had been set before him. He took apprentices, knowing they would one day try to kill him. Darth Maul, trained from childhood, was meant to be his weapon, his enforcer. When he fell, Sidious did not grieve. He simply moved to the next apprentice. Count Dooku was different, a former Jedi already powerful in his own right, but useful for a time. Sidious knew Dooku was not meant to be his true successor. He was a tool, a stepping stone to the real prize. Anakin Skywalker, the perfect apprentice, the one who would surpass all who came before. Sidious played a long game, shaping Anakin's path, ensuring his fall, twisting his loyalty, until there was no choice left but to serve. But even then, Sidious knew the truth of the Sith. No apprentice remained loyal forever. Darth Vader was powerful, but he was still bound by weakness. His past, his emotions, the flickering remnants of the Jedi within him, all of it made him incomplete. Sidious had no illusions that Vader would serve him forever. He knew that one day, the cycle would begin again. He had already begun seeking a replacement, another apprentice who could take Vader's place when the time came. The Sith did not build legacies based on loyalty. They built them based on survival. Every Sith Master was meant to be overthrown. Every apprentice was meant to surpass them. Sidious had played the game longer and better than any who had come before. He had broken the Jedi, reshaped the Republic, and secured his rule over the galaxy. But in the end, he was still a Sith, and the Sith could never escape their own nature. When Vader turned on Sidious, it was not an anomaly. It was not a failure in the rule of two. It was its final fulfillment. Vader had been weak for so long, bound by his own regret, by the chains of his past. But in that moment, he became strong. He did what every Sith apprentice was meant to do. He saw his master's weakness, and he struck. Sidious, who had built an empire on betrayal, was betrayed. But the Sith had never been about individuals. Sidious had ruled, but his death did not end the Sith. It never could. The rule of two was not just a way to ensure power passed from master to apprentice. It was a way to ensure that the Sith ideology survived, no matter what. Even when the last Sith Lord fell, their influence remained, their teachings endured, their methods continued to shape the galaxy. The Jedi had never understood this. They had always believed that if they could destroy the last Sith, the darkness would be gone forever. They never realized that the Sith had already won in ways they could not see. The Sith had built a legacy not on the survival of individuals, but on the survival of power itself. The Sith did not seek stability. They did not seek peace. They sought evolution, refinement, the endless pursuit of greater strength. Every master was meant to be replaced. Every apprentice was meant to rise. Even in death, the Sith endured. Their war was never truly with the Jedi. Their greatest battle had always been with themselves. And in that endless struggle, they found immortality. The Jedi had always believed they were the guardians of balance. They spoke of it as an ideal, a state of harmony where the Force flowed without corruption. They saw themselves as the counterweight to darkness, ensuring that the Sith could never tip the scales too far in their favor. But the truth was far more complicated. Balance, as the Jedi understood it, was a lie, one that the Sith had spent centuries manipulating. The concept of balance in the Force was never about eliminating darkness. The Jedi had convinced themselves that their dominance ensured balance, that the absence of the Sith meant harmony. They did not consider that their prolonged supremacy over the galaxy was, itself, an imbalance. The Force is not static. It is in constant motion, always shifting, always seeking equilibrium. For every rise there must be a fall. For every age of light, an age of darkness must follow. The Sith understood this far better than the Jedi. They knew that the cycle could not be broken, only controlled. They never sought to eradicate the Jedi entirely, only to diminish them, to weaken their influence, to ensure that when the Sith were in power, they could rule without opposition. They had no illusions of permanence. The Sith did not expect to reign forever. They expected to be overthrown, just as they had overthrown those who came before them. Darth Bane had recognized this when he enacted the rule of two. He knew that the Sith's infighting had led to their destruction, that their hunger for individual power had made them incapable of long-term rule. But he also knew that the Jedi's victory was only temporary. The Sith had been wiped out before, and yet they had returned. They always returned, because the Force demanded it. Palpatine mastered this idea in ways no Sith before him had. He did not merely destroy the Jedi, he used their own understanding of balance against them. He did not seek open war until he was certain they had already lost. He corrupted their greatest warrior, manipulated the very prophecy they believed would save them, and ensured that when the Jedi fell, they would fall by their own hands. The Chosen One prophecy was the Jedi's greatest miscalculation. They believed it spoke of one who would destroy the Sith, bringing balance to the Force. but they never questioned what balance truly meant. If the Sith had been absent for 1,000 years, then true balance could not be the Jedi maintaining their dominance. The return of the Sith was not a disruption of balance. It was the restoration of it. The Jedi had been so consumed with the idea that balance meant their victory that they never considered that it might mean their downfall. Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi's prophesied savior, became the instrument of their destruction. The Sith did not fight prophecy. They embraced it. They bent it to their will, ensuring that the very thing meant to undo them became their greatest weapon. Anakin's fall was not a tragedy. It was inevitability, a shift dictated by the Force itself. Even when the Jedi Order was seemingly destroyed, the Sith knew their time would not last forever. Palpatine sought to extend his rule, to break the cycle through sheer will, but the very structure of Sith ideology ensured his downfall. The apprentice always overthrows the master. That was the nature of the dark side. Palpatine thought he had conquered death, but the rule of two does not allow for eternity. His own creation, Darth Vader, was the one who would end him. And yet, even in apparent defeat, the Sith endured. Their ideas persisted. The Empire fell, but the structures it created remained. The galaxy had already been reshaped by Sith philosophy, and even after their supposed destruction, their methods continued. The Jedi returned, but they were never the same. The Force had shifted, as it always did. The cycle would continue. The Jedi could rise again, but they could never erase the past. They had tried before, wiping out knowledge of the Sith, believing they had ended the darkness for good. But the Sith had not needed armies to return. They had needed only patience. The Sith had never truly lost. They had understood the game far better than the Jedi. Balance was never about good triumphing over evil. It was about the Force's eternal struggle between the two. And in that struggle, the Sith had always ensured that no victory was ever permanent. The Sith never sought to rule forever. They knew that empires, no matter how powerful, would always fall. Palpatine's empire was not the end goal. It was a tool, a temporary manifestation of Sith dominance, a structure designed to serve a greater purpose. The true ambition of the Sith was never simply conquest. It was immortality, not just for individuals, but for their knowledge, their influence, their philosophy. The Jedi had always assumed that when the Sith were defeated, their teachings would vanish. They never understood how deeply the Sith had embedded themselves into the fabric of the galaxy. Even before Palpatine seized control of the Republic, Sith knowledge had been safeguarded, preserved in ways that ensured it could never be truly destroyed. The unknown regions had long been a place of mystery, a realm beyond the reach of the Republic, where hyperspace routes were unstable and civilizations remained undiscovered. For the Sith, it was more than a frontier. It was a sanctuary. Long before the Clone Wars, Sith Lords had hidden their most sacred teachings in these distant reaches. Temples, holocrons, entire archives of dark side knowledge, preserved far from the eyes of the Jedi. Even when the Sith appeared to be gone, their wisdom remained, waiting for those who would seek it. Palpatine had understood this better than any before him. While the galaxy saw him as the Emperor, he was always something more. His vision stretched beyond the Empire, beyond mere political rule. He had discovered the remnants of Sith civilizations in the unknown regions, powerful relics of an ancient past. These were not just monuments to old Sith Lords, they were blueprints for the future. The Sith Eternal was the culmination of this vision. Hidden away on Exegol, beyond the knowledge of even his most loyal Imperial officers, Palpatine had built something greater than an empire. He had built a cult, a secret order dedicated to ensuring that the Sith would never fade from existence. The Sith Eternal did not seek to control the galaxy through governments and laws. They sought to transcend mortality itself, to bind the Sith's influence to the very essence of the Force. Palpatine's experiments with cloning and essence transfer were not acts of desperation. They were the natural evolution of the Sith's desire to outlive death. Plagueis had theorized that the Force could be bent to sustain life indefinitely, that the dark side could be manipulated to cheat fate itself. Palpatine did not just inherit these ideas, he refined them, turning the Sith's greatest ambition into a reality. The Empire was only ever a stepping stone, a means to an end. While the Jedi believed they had won when the rebellion triumphed, they had only torn down what was meant to be temporary. The deeper truth remained. The Sith had planned for every fall, every defeat. Their knowledge endured, their influence whispered in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would once again be shaped by their will. The Jedi thought victory was the absence of the Sith, but the Sith had never sought permanence in the way the Jedi imagined. They had never needed to hold the throne forever. Their ideas had already transcended time, ensuring that even in apparent extinction, they would always return. The fall of the Empire was not the end of the Sith. Their influence had shaped the galaxy for too long, their philosophy too deeply ingrained in its systems, its leaders, and even the Force itself. While the Jedi believed they had restored peace, the Sith had already ensured that their legacy would persist. The Sith had never relied on survival in a physical sense. Their power was not just in their armies or their rule. It was in their ability to infect the galaxy with their ideology, to corrupt not just individuals, but the very nature of power itself. Even after Palpatine's death, the Sith's presence lingered in ways the Jedi could never fully cleanse. The Imperial warlords who emerged after the fall of the Empire were not Sith lords, but they were their successors in ideology. They had learned from the Sith's rule, control through fear, strength above all, the crushing of opposition before it could rise. They did not need to wield red lightsabers or speak the Sith code to carry their legacy forward. The Sith had already won in shaping the way power was understood in the galaxy. The remnants of the Empire, fractured but still dangerous, clung to Sith principles without even realizing it. The shadow networks of former Imperial officers, loyalists and warlords who refused to accept defeat followed the very teachings that had allowed the Sith to thrive for millennia: patience, secrecy, and control. They did not rush to reclaim the galaxy in open war. They consolidated power in the darkness, waiting for the right moment, ensuring that the spirit of the Sith lived on, even without a reigning master. But the Sith's influence was not just political. It extended into the Force itself. The Jedi had long believed that death was the end, that those who passed into the Force could no longer shape the material world unless they had achieved true enlightenment. They assumed the Sith, bound by selfishness and their fear of death, could never persist beyond the grave. They were wrong. The dark side did not function as the Jedi understood it. The Sith had spent centuries bending the Force to their will, manipulating its currents, leaving behind something more than just memory. Echoes of their presence, remnants of their power, haunted the galaxy long after their deaths. These were not Force ghosts in the way the Jedi became. Pure consciousness merged with the cosmic Force. The Sith did not surrender themselves to the Force. They clung to it, twisted it, corrupted it, so that their hatred, their ambition, and their will could remain. Palpatine was the greatest example of this. His death on the second Death Star was not the end of his influence. His contingency plans, his hidden cultists, and his experiments with essence transfer had already ensured that he would not simply fade away. whispers of his presence persisted, not just in the hidden corners of the galaxy where his loyalists remained, but in the Force itself. Those attuned to the dark side could still feel his presence, a shadow pressing against the edges of their minds, a lingering command to rebuild, to return. But Palpatine was not the first Sith to leave behind such an imprint. The ancient Sith Lords had done the same, binding themselves to their tombs, their artifacts, their strongholds. Their knowledge had never truly been lost because it had been preserved in the dark side itself, waiting for those who would seek it. The Jedi had believed that by destroying Sith artifacts and temples, they could erase their teachings, but they underestimated how deeply the Sith had embedded themselves into the fabric of the Force. This was the Sith's true victory. Even when they fell, their ideas persisted. Even when their empire crumbled, their influence remained. The Jedi could never truly defeat them, because the Sith had never relied on mere existence to endure. They had become something more than individuals, something more than an order. They had become an unshakable presence in the galaxy's history, in its power structures, in the very Force itself. The Sith had always understood that the battle was never about a single war, a single reign, or a single lifetime. It was about corruption. It was about ensuring that their influence remained, that even after their supposed destruction, they would still shape the future. They did not need to sit on the throne to rule. Their echoes in the Force ensured that they never truly left. The Jedi always spoke of victory as if it were a final state. Peace, balance, order. To them, the war with the Sith was something that could be won, an enemy that could be vanquished permanently. But the Sith never viewed war this way. Their fight was never about controlling the present. It was about shaping the future. It was never about ruling the galaxy for 1,000 years. It was about changing how power was understood for all time. And in that, they succeeded. The Jedi thought they were fighting a war of survival, a struggle between good and evil. They never realized that they were merely players in a much larger game, a conflict where the Sith had already determined the rules long before the first battle was fought. The Sith did not just seek control over governments, armies, or planets. That was the mistake people made when trying to understand them. The Sith sought control over reality itself, over the way the galaxy perceived strength, power, and the Force. They did not want to rule through oppression alone. They wanted to redefine what rule even meant. To the Sith, the Force was not a divine energy, not something to be worshipped or obeyed. It was a weapon, a tool, a force of nature that could be bent, manipulated, and remade to serve their will. The Jedi saw submission to the Force as the highest virtue. The Sith saw submission as weakness. This fundamental difference was at the heart of their war. For thousands of years, the Sith sought to prove that the Jedi were wrong, that the Force was not something to follow, but something to control. Every Sith Lord who rose understood this truth, and the greatest among them did not just wield the dark side. They rewrote the very fabric of the galaxy. Darth Plagueis, obsessed with immortality, did not seek to extend his life simply to rule forever. He sought to prove that the Force itself could be mastered, that the natural cycle of life and death was not a fixed law, but something that could be altered. Palpatine did not just seek to conquer the Republic. He sought to dismantle the very belief systems that had kept the Jedi in power. He did not just want to destroy them. He wanted to erase their relevance. And that was the true war, not the Clone Wars, not the battle between Jedi and Sith. The war was for reality itself. The Sith did not just seek to win battles. They sought to make the galaxy see power differently, to make people believe that control through fear was natural, to ensure that the Jedi's teachings faded, not because they were outlawed, but because they no longer made sense to a galaxy that had moved beyond them. Did they succeed? Look at the galaxy after their fall. The Jedi returned, but they were never the same. Their teachings no longer shaped the Republic. Their influence no longer extended as it once had. They survived, but they were no longer necessary. The Sith had reshaped history in a way that could not be undone. And here lies the greatest deception of all. The Jedi believed they had won. They overthrew the Emperor. They defeated the Sith. They rebuilt the Order. But the galaxy did not return to what it once was, because the Sith had already changed everything. The Sith did not need to be alive to win. Their ideas had already burrowed deep into the fabric of existence. Even in apparent defeat, their influence remained. The remnants of the Empire, fractured but still strong, carried forward the Sith's philosophy. Warlords, remnants of imperial power, continued to rule through fear, using the same principles that had allowed the Sith to thrive. They did not need Sith Lords to guide them. The Sith had already rewritten what power meant. The Force itself had been altered. The Sith had long sought to corrupt the Force, not through brute force, but through philosophy, their ideas, their will, their hatred. These things did not vanish. They left echoes. The Jedi believed that only those who had achieved true enlightenment could persist after death. They thought the Sith, consumed by greed and ambition, could never do the same. But they misunderstood the nature of the dark side. The Sith did not pass on as Jedi did, becoming luminous beings in the cosmic force. They did not seek that fate. They clung to the material world. They bound themselves to objects, to locations, to those who carried their legacy forward. The ancient Sith Lords had done this long before Palpatine, binding their spirits to tombs, to artifacts, to holocrons filled with their knowledge. They refused to fade, refused to let the Jedi erase them. And so, even after death, their whispers remained. Palpatine understood this better than any Sith before him. He was not concerned with ruling as an individual. He sought something far greater. His experiments with essence transfer, his hidden fleet on Exegol, the Sith Eternal, all of it was designed to ensure that the Sith never truly vanished. And they didn't. Even when the Emperor fell, his legacy remained. The final order, the remnants of his dark empire, was proof that his vision had outlived him. The Sith did not need to be present in the way they once were. Their shadow had already consumed the galaxy. So did they ever truly lose? If the Jedi had won, why did their order never truly return? Why did the Force remain in conflict? Why did the darkness always rise again? The Jedi sought to maintain balance. The Sith sought to remake it, and in doing so they ensured that no victory was ever permanent. And so, in the end, the Sith achieved what they had always desired. Not through an empire, not through a throne, not through a war that could be won. They achieved it by changing everything. And the Jedi never even saw it happen. So reconsider everything you thought you knew. The Jedi believed they were the heroes of history. But the Sith understood that history itself could be rewritten, and in that, they found their greatest triumph.